The knock on the door came before sunrise, hard and impatient, and Eleanor Ashworth knew before she opened it that her world was about to fall apart. Two men stood outside in the cold morning air, one of them holding a folded paper stamped with a red seal. They did not wait to be invited in. They stepped past her into the hallway of Ashwood Manor and told her, without any softness in their voices, that she had 5 days to pay what her late father owed, or the house, the land, and everything in it would be taken from her. Eleanor stood frozen in her nightdress, her bare feet cold against the stone floor, listening to numbers that made her stomach twist. The debt was enormous, far more than she had ever imagined her father capable of hiding from her. He had died 3 months earlier, leaving behind warm memories and a mountain of secrets, and now those secrets had grown teeth. The men left as quickly as they had come, their carriage wheels crunching down the gravel drive, and Eleanor sank onto the bottom stair, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Copper, her spaniel, padded softly to her side and pressed his warm body against her legs. He was old now, his muzzle turning gray, but his eyes were still bright with devotion. Eleanor buried her face in his fur and allowed herself 30 seconds of tears before she forced herself to stand. There was no time for grief, there was only time to think. She spent the next 2 days going through her father's papers, searching for anything that might explain how a respected gentleman could leave his only daughter buried under such ruin. What she found instead was worse than she expected. Her father had borrowed heavily from a man named Edmund Cole, a financier who had built his fortune by lending money to desperate families and then slowly tightening his grip until he owned everything they had. Cole had visited the manor twice since the funeral, each time offering Eleanor sympathy with one hand and pressure with the other. She had refused to discuss business with him, telling herself she still had time. Now she understood she had none at all. On the third morning, Eleanor walked into the village with Copper trotting beside her, his leash wrapped twice around her wrist out of habit rather than necessity, since he never strayed far from her. She had a small collection of silver spoons wrapped in cloth inside her basket, hoping to sell them to the local merchant for whatever she could get. It would not be enough. She knew that even as she walked, but she had to try something. The village square was quiet, except for a cart loaded with crates and a tall stranger standing beside it, speaking with the merchant in low tones. Eleanor barely glanced at him as she approached the shop, her mind consumed with calculations that never balanced. The merchant examined her spoons with a practiced eye and offered a price so low it barely covered a week of bread. Eleanor's hands trembled as she accepted anyway, because something was better than nothing. It was as she turned to leave that the stranger spoke to her directly. His voice was calm, deep, and unhurried, the voice of a man who had never once worried about where his next meal would come from. He complimented Copper, crouching down to let the old dog sniff his gloved hand, and Copper, ever trusting, leaned into the stranger's touch as though they were old friends. Eleanor watched the exchange with a strange ache in her chest. She had not seen Copper warm to anyone so quickly since her father died. The stranger asked about the dog's breed, his age, his temperament, and Eleanor answered without thinking much of it, grateful for a few moments where her mind was not spinning through numbers she could not make add up. Then the stranger said something that stopped her breath. He said he had been searching for a companion animal for his elderly mother, who lived alone in the countryside and had grown lonely since his father's passing. He said Copper had exactly the gentle nature he had been hoping to find, and he would be willing to pay a generous sum for him, more than enough to cover a family's expenses for many months. Eleanor's first instinct was to refuse. Copper was not for sale. He was the last living creature who remembered her father's voice, who had slept at the foot of her bed every night since she was 12 years old. But even as she opened her mouth to decline, the number the stranger mentioned settled into her mind like a stone dropping into still water. It was not the full amount of the debt, not nearly, but it would buy her time. Days, perhaps a week. Enough time to think of something else. She looked down at Copper, who was still leaning happily against the stranger's leg, utterly unaware that his future was being decided above his head. Guilt rose in her throat like bile. She thought of the men who had come to her door, of the cold certainty in their eyes, of the estate that held her mother's garden and her father's study, and every memory she had of being loved. She thought of the servants who depended on her, of old Margaret who had no other home to go to, of the tenants whose cottages sat on Ashwood land. Eleanor asked for a moment to think, and the stranger, to his credit, did not press her. He simply waited, his expression unreadable, while she crouched down and took Copper's face gently in her hands. She whispered an apology to him that no one else could hear, promising him it would only be for a little while, promising herself the same thing even though some part of her already suspected it was a lie. When she stood again, she nodded. The stranger did not smile in triumph. which she noticed even through her heartbreak. Instead, his face seemed to soften with something closer to sympathy, though she was too consumed by grief to wonder why a man buying a dog for his mother would look at her that way. He paid her the full amount in coin, more than he had first offered, saying simply that a companion so gentle deserved it. He took Copper's leash from her trembling hand, and the old dog looked back at her once, his tail wagging uncertainly, not understanding why his mistress was letting him walk away. Eleanor watched the cart disappear around the bend in the road, clutching the small bag of coins to her chest, as though it might disappear too if she loosened her grip. She did not cry until she was well outside the village, hidden behind a hedgerow where no one could see her. She cried the way she had not allowed herself to cry since her father's funeral. Deep and silent sobs that shook her shoulders. Grief for her father, grief for her home, grief for the one warm thing she had just given away with her own hands. She did not know, as she walked back to Ashwood Manor with her empty leash still coiled in her pocket out of habit, that the stranger's cart had not turned toward the countryside at all. She did not know that the man who called himself a devoted son shopping for his lonely mother was, in truth, Duke Nathaniel Ravensworth, one of the wealthiest and most influential men in the county, traveling without his title, or his usual retinue, because he found people spoke more honestly to a stranger than to a duke. She did not know that he had recognized her name the moment the merchant addressed her as Miss Ashworth, that he had known her father slightly through business dealings years ago, and that he had heard whispers in recent weeks about the Ashworth debts, and about a financier named Edmund Cole who was circling the family like a hawk waiting for wounded prey to stop moving. She did not know that Nathaniel had come to the village that morning for no reason connected to dogs or mothers at all, but simply to see for himself what kind of woman Eleanor Ashworth was before he decided how far he was willing to go to help her. She did not know that as his cart rolled away from the village, Nathaniel sat with Copper's head resting on his knee, and that his jaw was tight with something that was not quite anger and not quite pity, but a strange, sharp resolve that had settled into his chest the moment he watched Eleanor whisper her goodbye to the only friend she had left. Back at Ashwood Manor, Eleanor placed the coins carefully in a locked drawer in her father's study, the same drawer where she had found the terrible letters detailing his debts. She sat at his desk for a long time afterward, staring at the empty dog bed in the corner of the room, the blanket still holding the shape of Copper's body, still smelling faintly of him. Margaret, the elderly housekeeper who had served the family for 3 decades, found her there at dusk and did not ask questions. She simply set a cup of tea beside Eleanor's elbow and rested a hand briefly on her shoulder before withdrawing, understanding that some grief needed silence more than words. That night, Eleanor lay awake listening to the wind move through the trees outside her window, straining out of habit for the sound of Copper's paws on the floorboards, the small comforting weight of him settling at the foot of her bed. The silence in his place was unbearable. She told herself again and again that she had done what needed to be done, that a dog could not eat when there was no money for food, that sentiment could not save a family from ruin. She told herself the coins in that locked drawer meant her tenants would have another month in their homes, that Margaret would not be turned out into the cold, that she had bought herself time to find a real solution. But even as she recited these justifications to the darkness, a small, stubborn part of her heart refused to be comforted. She thought of Copper somewhere unfamiliar, confused and frightened, wondering why the woman who had loved him his whole life had let him go. She pressed her face into her pillow and allowed herself one more round of tears, silent this time, exhausted, before sleep finally pulled her under. 5 days remained until Edmund Cole's deadline. Eleanor did not yet know that the money in her drawer would barely make a dent in what he claimed she owed. She did not know that Cole had never intended to simply collect a debt, that his true aim had always been the estate itself, and beyond that, herself, bound to him through marriage or ruin, whichever path proved easier. She did not know that somewhere across the county, a duke she had mistaken for an ordinary traveler was already giving orders to his solicitor, setting into motion a plan that would upend everything she thought she understood about her situation. All Eleanor knew, as she finally drifted into uneasy sleep, was that she had sold the one soft thing left in her life, to buy herself a few more days of fighting for everything else. She did not yet understand that those few days would change her life, in ways far beyond anything she could have imagined, or that the empty space at the foot of her bed would not stay empty forever. Nathaniel Ravensworth did not go home that evening. Instead, he directed his driver to the offices of his solicitor, a sharp and discreet man named Percival Whitlock, who had handled the Ravensworth family's affairs for over 20 years, and had learned long ago never to question his employer's unusual requests. Nathaniel arrived still in his plain traveling coat, Copper curled contentedly on the seat beside him, and by the time he stepped into Whitlock's office, his mind was already made up. He explained what he wanted with the calm precision of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He wanted every detail of the Ashworth family's finances uncovered within 2 days. He wanted to know exactly how much was owed, to whom, and under what terms. He wanted to know everything about Edmund Cole, the financier whose name kept surfacing in connection with the debt, and he wanted it done quietly, without a single whisper reaching Eleanor Ashworth or anyone in her household. Whitlock raised an eyebrow but did not ask why a duke would concern himself with the debts of a minor estate 2 counties away. He had worked for Nathaniel long enough to recognize when his employer's interest in a matter went beyond simple business, though he was wise enough not to say so aloud. He merely nodded, took notes, and promised a full report within the requested time. 2 days later, Whitlock returned with a folder thick with documents, and what Nathaniel read inside it made his hands tighten around the pages until his knuckles went pale. The debt itself was real, left behind by Eleanor's father, who had made a series of poor investments in his final years and borrowed heavily to cover his losses. But the terms of the loan were far more troubling than a simple debt. Edmund Cole had structured the agreement so that if the debt was not repaid in full by a specific date, ownership of Ashwood Manor and its surrounding lands would transfer directly to him. No negotiation required. Worse still, Whitlock had uncovered letters, obtained through careful and legal inquiry, suggesting that Cole had approached several acquaintances of the Ashworth family, quietly floating the idea of a marriage between himself and Eleanor as an alternative to foreclosure. Cole was twice her age, a man with a reputation for cruelty toward those who owed him money and toward the wives of men who had once worked beneath him. He was not offering Eleanor rescue. He was offering her a different kind of trap, one with a wedding ring instead of an eviction notice, though the outcome for her freedom would be much the same. Nathaniel set the folder down and sat in silence for a long moment, staring at nothing. He thought of Eleanor's face in the village square, the way she had crouched down to say goodbye to her dog as though she were losing a piece of her own heart. He thought of the quiet dignity with which she had accepted his coin, never once begging, never once making a spectacle of her grief in front of him. He thought of what it must have cost her to make that choice, and he felt something in his chest harden into resolve. He would not allow Edmund Cole to have her. Not the estate, and certainly not the woman. But Nathaniel was careful, and he understood that charity given carelessly could wound as deeply as poverty itself. Eleanor Ashworth had struck him as fiercely proud, the kind of woman who would rather lose everything than accept pity from a stranger. If he simply appeared at her door and offered to pay her debts outright, she would almost certainly refuse, and worse, she might feel humiliated by the gesture, as though he had seen her as a helpless creature to be rescued, rather than a capable woman facing hardship. So he devised another plan. He instructed Whitlock to quietly purchase the debt from Edmund Cole through an intermediary, a trading company, with no obvious connection to the Ravensworth name. Cole, who cared only about profit and had no particular attachment to owning the Ashworth estate himself as long as he was paid, agreed to the sale without much resistance, believing he was simply selling the debt to another investor looking for a bargain. He did not know, and would not know for some time, that the buyer was the very duke who had quietly become interested in the fate of the woman he had been circling like a predator. Within a week, the debt belonged entirely to Nathaniel, though Eleanor had no idea her creditor had changed. He instructed Whitlock to draft new terms, far gentler than Cole's original agreement, with an extended timeline and no threat of immediate foreclosure. He wanted her to have breathing room, time enough to rebuild without the constant terror of losing her home hanging over her head. But he did not want her to know where that mercy had come from. Not yet. He told himself it was because she would refuse it if she knew, and that was partly true. But there was another reason buried beneath the first, one he did not examine too closely. He wanted, for reasons he could not fully explain even to himself, to know her as simply a man might know a woman, without the weight of debts and titles pressing down between them. Copper, meanwhile, had settled into life at Ravensworth Hall with surprising ease. The old spaniel spent his days dozing by the fire in Nathaniel's study, occasionally following the Duke from room to room with the loyal persistence of a creature who had quickly transferred his affection to whoever fed him and spoke to him kindly. The household staff adored him. The head housekeeper, a warm woman named Beatrice, took to slipping him small treats from the kitchen, and the stable boys competed for the chance to walk him along the garden paths each morning. But there were moments, quiet ones, when Copper would sit by the window facing the direction of the village, ears pricked, as though listening for a voice that never came. Nathaniel noticed this more than once, and each time it happened, something in his chest tightened with a mixture of guilt and determination. He had not lied outright to Eleanor, not technically, but he had allowed her to believe a story that was not entirely true. And though he told himself it was for a good cause, the deception sat uneasily with him. Back at Ashwood Manor, Eleanor spent her days in a haze of quiet desperation, going through what little remained of value in the house, trying to determine what else could be sold without drawing attention from the village or raising further questions from her already worried staff. Margaret watched her with growing concern, noting the dark circles beneath Eleanor's eyes and the way she had stopped humming to herself while she worked in the garden, a habit Margaret had known since Eleanor was a child. On the 4th day after Copper's sale, a letter arrived at Ashwood Manor, bearing an unfamiliar seal. Eleanor opened it with trembling hands, expecting more bad news, another threat, another impossible demand. Instead, she found a formal notice from a firm she had never heard of, informing her that her father's debt had been purchased by a new holder and that the terms had been revised. The letter stated plainly that she now had 6 months, rather than 5 days, to arrange repayment, and that no action would be taken against the estate during that time. Eleanor read the letter 3 times, certain she had misunderstood. She showed it to Margaret, who read it just as carefully and shook her head slowly, equally baffled. Neither of them could imagine who would purchase such a debt, only to soften its terms so dramatically. Eleanor's first thought, sharp and suspicious, was that this was some new trick of Edmund Cole's, a way to lull her into complacency before striking harder later. She wrote immediately to the firm listed on the letter, demanding to know who now held her family's debt and why the terms had changed. The response she received, days later, was carefully worded and frustratingly vague. It stated only that the new holder wished to remain anonymous for the time being, and that the revised terms were final and would not be altered regardless of her inquiries. Eleanor paced the length of her father's study for an hour after reading it, torn between relief and suspicion. 6 months was an eternity compared to 5 days. 6 months meant time to sell off unused land, to negotiate with tenants for early rent, to perhaps find some way to salvage the estate without losing everything at once. But who would do such a thing for a stranger, and why? She thought, briefly and absurdly, of the man from the village square, the one who had bought Copper with such quiet kindness in his eyes. But she dismissed the thought almost as quickly as it arrived. He had been a stranger seeking a companion for his mother, nothing more, and the sum he had paid for Copper, generous as it was, could not possibly account for the difference this new arrangement made to her family's fortune. It was a foolish thought, she told herself, born of exhaustion and grief, and she pushed it firmly from her mind. Edmund Cole, however, did not take the news of the sold debt calmly. When he learned, through his own network of informants, that his hold over the Ashworth estate had been quietly purchased out from under him by an anonymous buyer, his fury was immediate and cold. He had been patient with Eleanor, precisely because he believed time was on his side, certain that desperation would eventually deliver her into his hands, whether through marriage or foreclosure. Now, with the debt gone and the pressure lifted, his careful plan had been disrupted by a rival he could not even identify. He rode to Ashwood Manor the very next day, arriving unannounced and demanding to see Eleanor immediately. She received him in the drawing room, standing rather than sitting, a small act of defiance that did not go unnoticed by a man used to people cowering before him. Cole's questions came sharp and probing, thinly disguised beneath a veneer of concern. Had she found a new benefactor? Had she made some arrangement she had not disclosed to him? Did she understand the danger of accepting help from strangers who might expect far more in return than mere gratitude? Eleanor, though her heart pounded with uncertainty, held her ground, telling him honestly that she knew nothing more than what the letter had revealed, that she had no benefactor, no secret arrangement, nothing but a stroke of unexpected fortune she did not fully understand herself. Cole did not believe her. That much was clear in the tightness of his jaw and the calculating way his eyes moved over her, but he had no proof to contradict her words, and he left the manor with a warning rather than a threat, telling her that circumstances could change quickly, and that she would be wise to remember who had once been willing to help her when no one else would. After he left, Eleanor sank into a chair, her legs finally giving way beneath the weight of the encounter. Margaret brought her tea and sat with her in silence, both women aware that whatever relief the new debt terms had brought, danger had not truly passed. Somewhere out there, a stranger held enormous power over her family's fate, and Edmund Cole, humiliated and furious, was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully. Eleanor did not know that within a fortnight, that same stranger would arrive at her door in person, not as an anonymous benefactor hidden behind legal documents, but as himself, introducing himself under his own name for the very first time, setting into motion a meeting that would change everything she believed about debts, about dukes, and about the quiet grief still tucked away in the empty space at the foot of her bed. The carriage arrived at Ashwood Manor on a gray morning, without warning, its polished panels and matched horses immediately marking it as belonging to someone of far greater wealth than any visitor the household had seen in months. Margaret spotted it first from the kitchen window and rushed to find Eleanor, her voice tight with alarm, certain that whatever powerful stranger now held their debt had finally come to collect in person. Eleanor smoothed her worn gray dress with shaking hands and went to the door herself, her chin lifted with a courage she did not entirely feel. When the door opened, she found herself staring, for one disorienting moment, into a face she recognized but could not place, until the memory struck her all at once. It was him, the stranger from the village square, the man who had bought copper. Except now he was dressed not as a simple traveler but as a gentleman of unmistakable rank, his coat cut from fine dark wool, a signet ring catching the weak morning light on his hand. Behind him stood a liveried footman holding the door of the very carriage that had drawn Margaret's alarm, and beside him, to Eleanor's utter astonishment, stood Copper, tail wagging furiously, straining against his leash the moment he caught sight of her. Eleanor's breath left her in a rush. She dropped to her knees without thinking, and Copper bounded forward, nearly knocking her over in his eagerness, licking her face and pressing his whole trembling body against hers as though he could not get close enough. Tears sprang to her eyes before she could stop them, and for a long moment she forgot entirely about the stranger standing above her, lost completely in the reunion with the one creature she had thought she might never see again. When she finally looked up, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand, embarrassment flooding through her at having lost her composure so completely in front of a visitor, the man was watching her with an expression she could not quite read, something between tenderness and guilt. He introduced himself then, formally, as Duke Nathaniel Ravensworth, and Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her feet. The Duke, the man she had spoken to so plainly in the village square, believing him an ordinary traveler shopping for his mother's companion, was in truth one of the most powerful men in the county. She rose slowly to her feet, Copper pressed against her legs, confusion and wariness beginning to replace her initial joy. Nathaniel explained, choosing his words with visible care, that he had come to return Copper to her, that his mother had in truth passed many years ago, and there had never been any lonely woman in the countryside waiting for a companion, that he had told her a story that morning in the village because he had wanted to help without frightening her away with the truth of who he was. Eleanor's confusion sharpened into something closer to suspicion as she listened, her arms crossing instinctively over her chest. She asked him plainly why a duke would trouble himself over a spoonful of silver and a spaniel belonging to a family he had never met. Nathaniel hesitated, and in that hesitation, Eleanor saw something shift in his expression, a decision being made behind his eyes. He told her, carefully, that he had known her father slightly through business dealings years ago, that he had heard troubling rumors about the debts left behind after his death, and that watching her give up her dog in the village square had moved him to look further into her circumstances. He did not yet tell her that he was the anonymous buyer who now held her family's debt. He watched her closely as he spoke, gauging how much truth she could accept in one sitting, and something in her guarded, exhausted face told him this was not the moment to reveal everything. Instead, he simply said he wished to return Copper to her, that keeping him had felt wrong from the moment he saw how the old dog pined for her, sitting by windows and refusing his food for the first 2 days at Ravensworth Hall. Eleanor's throat tightened at the thought of Copper refusing to eat, grieving for her the same way she had grieved for him. She thanked Nathaniel stiffly, unable to fully release her suspicion even as gratitude warred within her. She did not offer to return the coin he had paid for Copper, mostly because she had already spent a portion of it on urgent repairs to the roof, and the rest sat locked away as her only remaining cushion against ruin. Nathaniel, seeming to sense her discomfort, told her gently that the money was hers to keep regardless, a gift rather than a purchase reversed. He stayed longer than either of them perhaps expected, accepting Margaret's offer of tea with easy grace, despite the modest chipped cups and the threadbare state of the drawing-room furniture. He asked Eleanor about the estate, about her father, about her own hopes for Ashwood Manor's future, and Eleanor found herself answering more honestly than she intended, disarmed by the genuine attention in his questions, so different from the calculating interest she had grown used to from Edmund Cole. When he finally rose to leave, he asked, with a formality that seemed almost nervous for a man of his rank, whether he might call on her again. Eleanor hesitated, torn between the wariness that recent months had taught her to feel toward powerful men, and the undeniable warmth that had settled in her chest during his visit. She agreed, cautiously, telling herself it would be foolish to refuse further kindness from a man in his position, regardless of what her heart was doing. After his carriage disappeared down the drive, Eleanor sat on the front steps with Copper's head resting heavily in her lap, running her fingers through his familiar fur, hardly able to believe he was truly back. Margaret joined her a few minutes later, settling onto the step beside her with a knowing look that made Eleanor's cheeks warm despite herself. Word of the Duke's visit spread through the small village faster than either of them anticipated, carried by the footman's brief stop at the local inn for water, and by Margaret's own unguarded excitement when she mentioned it to the baker's wife. Within 2 days, half the village seemed to know that Duke Ravensworth had called personally on Eleanor Ashworth, and speculation about the reason for his visit multiplied with each retelling. The news reached Edmund Cole by the 3rd day, delivered by one of the informants he kept scattered through the surrounding villages for exactly this purpose. His reaction was immediate and venomous. He had already suspected some unseen hand had interfered with his plans for the Ashworth debt, and now, hearing that a duke, one of the wealthiest and most respected men in the region, had personally visited Eleanor and returned her dog to her, the pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. Cole understood immediately that if Nathaniel Ravensworth had taken a personal interest in Eleanor Ashworth, his own hopes of claiming either the estate or the woman herself through marriage were effectively finished. No amount of pressure or manipulation he could apply would outweigh the influence and wealth of a duke. His fury curdled into something colder and more dangerous, a determination not to lose gracefully, but to inflict damage on his way out, if damage was all that remained available to him. He began, quietly at first, to spread rumors of his own throughout the county, suggesting that Eleanor Ashworth was a woman of questionable character, that she had been seen entertaining a wealthy stranger under circumstances no respectable young woman should permit, that perhaps her father's debts had been the least of the family's troubles. He knew such rumors, even unproven, could stain a woman's reputation permanently in a society that valued propriety above almost everything else, and he intended to use every weapon available to him. Eleanor remained blissfully unaware of this campaign in the days immediately following Nathaniel's visit, her attention consumed instead by the strange, tentative warmth blooming in her chest whenever she thought of him. He called again within the week, this time bringing a small selection of books he thought she might enjoy, having noticed the well-worn spines lining the shelves of her father's study during his first visit. Their conversation flowed more easily this time, touching on literature, on her memories of her mother, who had died when Eleanor was young, on his own responsibilities as Duke, and the loneliness that sometimes accompanied a life spent surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Eleanor found herself laughing during that second visit, a real, unguarded laugh that surprised her with how unfamiliar it felt after months of grief and fear. Copper lay contentedly between their 2 chairs, occasionally lifting his head to look between them as though satisfied with how the arrangement had turned out. For the first time since her father's death, Eleanor allowed herself to imagine a future that did not consist entirely of survival, one that might, impossibly, include something like happiness. But even as this fragile hope took root, whispers of Cole's rumors began reaching her ears through Margaret, who heard them first from the butcher's wife, and reported them to Eleanor with visible distress. Eleanor's stomach turned cold at the description of what was being said about her in the village, the implications about her character, about her supposed desperation to secure a wealthy protector by any means available. She understood immediately who was behind it, and a fresh wave of anger joined the fear already coiling in her chest. Margaret urged her to write to the Duke and tell him everything, insisting that a man of his character would want to know what was being said and would surely act to stop it. Eleanor refused, pride and fear tangled together in her refusal. She had spent months proving to herself that she could manage the estate's troubles without leaning entirely on anyone else, and some stubborn part of her could not bear the thought of running to Nathaniel each time trouble found her, as though she were a helpless girl incapable of standing on her own. She told Margaret she would handle Cole's rumors in her own way, though in truth she had no plan at all beyond hoping the gossip would burn itself out. It did not burn out. If anything, it grew louder with each passing day. Eleanor began noticing the way conversations stilled when she entered the village shops, the way certain women who had once greeted her warmly now offered only tight, polite nods before hurrying past. The vicar's wife, who had known Eleanor since childhood, stopped her outside the church one afternoon and, with what she clearly believed was kindness, warned her gently that a young woman in her position could not afford even the appearance of impropriety, that reputation once lost was rarely recovered in full. Eleanor walked home that day with her cheeks burning, humiliation and fury churning together in her chest. She had done nothing wrong. She had accepted the return of her own dog and the company of a man who had shown her nothing but courtesy, and yet somehow she was being made to feel as though she had committed some grave sin against propriety. She thought of her father, of how carefully he had always guarded the family name, and grief mixed with her anger until she could barely tell the two apart. She considered, briefly, cutting off contact with Nathaniel entirely, reasoning that if he simply stopped visiting, the rumors might fade for lack of fresh fuel. But even as she turned the idea over in her mind, she recognized the deeper unfairness in it, that she would be punishing herself for Edmund Cole's cruelty, surrendering the one bright thing in her difficult life, because a bitter man could not accept losing his grip on her family's fortune. She resolved, with the same stubborn courage that had carried her through the darkest weeks after her father's death, that she would not give Cole the satisfaction of watching her retreat. Still, the strain began to show. Margaret noticed Eleanor sleeping poorly again, noticed her picking at her meals and staring too long out of windows, and worried silently that the fragile peace her mistress had found in recent weeks was slipping away beneath the weight of village gossip and unspoken fear. Copper seemed to sense the change too, staying closer to Eleanor's side than usual, resting his head on her knee during the long evenings when she sat alone in her father's study, going over the estate's ledgers by candlelight in search of solutions that never quite materialized. Instead, she smiled through their conversation, accepted his easy warmth, and told herself the rumors would fade on their own if she simply refused to acknowledge them. She did not yet understand that Edmund Cole had no intention of letting the matter fade quietly, that his wounded pride demanded a far more public reckoning, one that would force Eleanor into a confrontation she could not avoid and could not control, and that would ultimately expose secrets neither she nor Nathaniel had yet been ready to share. An invitation arrived at Ashwood Manor a week later, thick and formal, bearing the crest of Lady Featherington, a well-known hostess whose autumn gathering was considered one of the more important social events of the county. Eleanor stared at the elegant card for a long moment, torn between the temptation to refuse and the growing recognition that hiding from society would only give Edmund Cole's rumors more room to grow unchecked. Margaret, ever practical, argued firmly that Eleanor needed to be seen, that walking confidently into a room full of people who had been whispering about her was the surest way to prove those whispers false. Eleanor spent an evening altering one of her mother's old gowns, a deep green silk that had gone out of fashion years ago, but still fit her well enough with a few careful adjustments. She told herself the effort was only about appearing respectable, nothing more, though a small, honest part of her admitted she hoped Nathaniel might also be present, and that some part of her wanted him to see her looking like more than a grieving woman drowning in debt. He was indeed present, and the moment she entered Lady Featherington's crowded drawing room, Eleanor felt his attention find her across the space almost immediately, a warmth in his expression that steadied her nerves more than she cared to admit. He made his way to her side within minutes, offering his arm with easy confidence, and though she noticed a few pointed glances directed their way, whispers behind fans and raised eyebrows, his calm presence beside her made it easier to ignore them. They spoke for a long while that evening, drifting gradually away from the thickest crowds toward a quieter corner near the tall windows overlooking the garden. Nathaniel asked about her father's old study, about the books she had been rereading, about small, ordinary things that had nothing to do with debts or estates or duty. Eleanor found herself relaxing more fully than she had in months, laughing at a dry observation he made about one of the more pompous guests, forgetting for a stretch of time that anyone else in the room existed at all. It was during this conversation that Nathaniel, watching her laugh with her guard finally lowered, felt something settle firmly in his chest, a certainty he had been circling for weeks without fully naming. He admired her resilience, her sharp intelligence, the way she carried herself with dignity despite everything life had thrown at her in recent months. He found himself wanting, more than he had wanted almost anything in years, to be the kind of man she could trust completely, without secrets standing between them. And yet the secret of the debt still sat unspoken, heavier with each passing week that he failed to reveal it. He told himself repeatedly that the right moment had simply not yet arrived, that revealing the truth too soon might frighten her away, before she had come to trust him for himself, rather than for what he had quietly done for her family. But watching her that evening, so open and unguarded, a small voice in the back of his mind warned him that waiting too long carried its own risks, that secrets kept out of caution had a way of curdling into something that looked, from the outside, very much like deception. Eleanor, for her part, noticed nothing of his internal struggle, too absorbed in the simple, rare pleasure of an evening spent in good company. When their conversation was interrupted by another guest requesting Nathaniel's attention on some matter of local business, Eleanor drifted toward the refreshment table, her spirits lighter than they had been in weeks, humming softly to herself for the first time since copper had been returned to her. It was there, near the refreshment table, that Edmund Cole found her. He approached with the easy smile of a man accustomed to social gatherings, greeting her with false warmth that immediately set Eleanor's nerves on edge. He commented, in a voice pitched just loud enough for nearby guests to overhear, on how well she seemed to be recovering from her family's recent troubles, on how fortunate she was to have found such a generous new companion in the Duke. His words were polite on their surface, but the insinuation beneath them was unmistakable, and Eleanor felt her cheeks flush with anger, even as she forced her expression to remain composed. She responded coolly, telling him that Duke Ravensworth was simply a kind acquaintance, and that she would thank him to keep his speculation to himself. Cole's smile did not waver, but something colder flickered behind his eyes, a warning that he had not finished, that this brief exchange was merely the opening move in whatever larger game he intended to play. He excused himself shortly after, but not before adding, in a voice laced with quiet menace, that reputations were fragile things, and that even a duke's favor could not protect a woman forever from the consequences of poor choices. Eleanor stood frozen for a moment after he walked away, her heart pounding, the earlier warmth of the evening curdling into anxious dread. She glanced across the room to where Nathaniel stood in conversation with several other gentlemen, unaware of what had just transpired, and she felt a fresh wave of shame at the thought of him overhearing such implications about her character. She said nothing to him about the encounter for the rest of the evening, forcing herself to smile through the remaining hours, though the ease she had felt earlier had evaporated entirely. On the carriage ride home, Eleanor sat in silence, replaying Cole's words over and over, trying to determine what he might be planning next. She had seen enough of his calculating nature over the past months to know that a man like Edmund Cole did not make idle threats. Whatever he intended, she suspected it would not remain confined to whispered insinuations at a private gathering for much longer. Her fears proved well-founded within days. Cole began appearing at more social events than he had previously bothered attending, always finding some opportunity to mention Eleanor's name in conversation, always framing his comments with just enough ambiguity to avoid outright accusation, while still planting seeds of doubt about her character and her intentions toward the Duke. He suggested to several prominent families that Eleanor had been maneuvering for months to secure a wealthy protector, first through calculated encounters, and then through carefully staged gratitude over a returned pet, a narrative that painted her not as a woman recovering from hardship, but as a scheming opportunist. The rumors reached Nathaniel eventually, carried to him by his own circle of acquaintances who assumed, given his recent visits to Ashwood Manor, that he would want to know what was being said. He listened to the reports with mounting anger, recognizing immediately the source and the intention behind them. He understood now, with a clarity that had perhaps been slower to arrive than it should have, that his continued silence about the true nature of his involvement in Eleanor's finances was no longer simply a matter of timing, but had become a vulnerability that Cole was actively exploiting. He rode to Ashwood Manor the following morning, determined to tell Eleanor everything before Cole could twist the truth into something uglier than it was. But when he arrived, he found the household in a state of quiet crisis. Eleanor met him at the door with a letter clutched in her hand, her face pale with a fresh kind of fear, one that had nothing to do with rumors or reputation. Edmund Cole, furious at losing his hold over both the estate and the woman he had hoped to claim, had filed a formal legal challenge disputing the transfer of the original debt, claiming irregularities in how the sale had been conducted, and demanding that the matter be reviewed publicly before the county magistrate. The letter Eleanor held summoned her to appear at a hearing in 1 week's time, where the details of her family's finances, and whoever now held their debt, would be examined before witnesses. Nathaniel stood very still on the doorstep, the letter's implications settling over him like a cold weight. He had come that morning intending to confess everything gently, in his own time and in his own words, and now he found himself instead facing the very question he had hoped to answer before it was ever asked, standing in front of a woman whose trust he had worked so carefully to earn. For one brief, cowardly moment, he considered deflecting, telling her he knew nothing and would look into the matter on her behalf, buying himself a few more days to find gentler words. But he looked at Eleanor's face, drawn and frightened, clutching a letter that threatened to expose her family's private ruin before the entire county, and he understood that any further delay would only make the eventual truth harder to forgive. He asked if they might speak somewhere private, and Eleanor, sensing something serious in the set of his jaw, led him into her father's study and closed the door behind them. He told her then, plainly and without excuse, that he was the one who had purchased her family's debt from Edmund Cole, that he had done so quietly through an intermediary, specifically because he feared she would refuse the help if she knew it came from him, and that he had intended to explain everything in his own time, though he now recognized how that intention looked from her side of the situation. He watched her face carefully as he spoke, bracing himself for anger, for the accusation of manipulation that he knew he deserved to hear. Eleanor said nothing for a long moment, her mind reeling backward through every kind gesture of the past weeks, reassessing each one now that she understood the truth sitting beneath it. The revised debt terms, the gentle return of Copper. Even his sudden, easy friendship, which she had believed was born simply of two people enjoying each other's company, now seemed tangled up with obligation and secrecy, in ways that made her stomach twist with a fresh, unfamiliar kind of hurt. She asked him, quietly, how long he had known, and he answered honestly that he had suspected the moment he learned her name in the village square, and had confirmed everything within days of buying Copper. The timeline settled over her like ice water. Nearly every interaction they had shared since that first meeting had happened under the shadow of a secret he had chosen, again and again, not to share with her. Eleanor did not raise her voice, though her hands trembled where they gripped the edge of her father's desk. She told him she understood his intentions had likely come from kindness, that she did not doubt his good character, but that kindness built on concealment was still, in the end, a kind of deception, one that had left her feeling foolish and exposed at the very moment she needed clarity most. She reminded him, with quiet dignity, that she had spent months fighting to prove she could manage her own affairs, and that discovering a powerful man had been quietly managing them behind her back, however gently intentioned, stripped something important from her sense of her own capability. Nathaniel absorbed her words without argument, recognizing the truth in each one even as they landed like blows. He did not defend himself further, understanding that any explanation now would sound like excuse rather than apology. He told her simply that he was sorry, that he had let his fear of losing her trust lead him into the very deception most likely to destroy it, and that whatever she decided about the hearing, about their acquaintance, about anything at all going forward, he would respect her wishes completely. The looming legal challenge from Edmund Cole now sat between them alongside this fresh wound, and Eleanor, overwhelmed by the weight of both, asked Nathaniel quietly to leave, telling him she needed time to think before facing the magistrate's hearing that awaited her within the week. He left without protest, though the look on his face as he departed carried a grief that mirrored her own. Two people who had found something rare and unexpected in each other, now separated by a secret that should never have been allowed to grow so large in the dark. The week before the hearing passed slowly and painfully for Eleanor. She spent long hours alone in her father's study, going over what documents she had, trying to prepare herself for a public examination of her family's finances that she barely understood herself. Margaret hovered nearby with worried eyes, bringing tea that went cold untouched, watching her mistress grow paler and more withdrawn with each passing day. Copper stayed close, resting his head against Eleanor's knee during the long evenings, as though he alone understood the full weight of what she was carrying. Nathaniel did not call again during that week, respecting the space Eleanor had asked for, though the distance cost him more than he let on to anyone, including himself. He instructed Whitlock to prepare every document proving the legitimacy of the debt's transfer, determined that whatever else happened between himself and Eleanor personally, he would not allow Edmund Cole's legal challenge to succeed on a technicality. He also began quietly gathering evidence of Cole's broader pattern of predatory lending, statements from other families who had suffered under similar tactics, testimonies that painted a far darker picture of the man than the respectable financier he presented to society. The morning of the hearing arrived gray and cold, fitting for the dread that had settled over Ashwood Manor. Eleanor dressed carefully, choosing a simple dark dress that spoke of neither wealth nor desperation, and rode into the county town with Margaret beside her for support, her hands clasped tightly in her lap the entire journey. The magistrate's hall was already crowded when they arrived, word of the dispute having spread through the county's social circles with the same speed as any juicy piece of gossip, and Eleanor felt dozens of curious eyes track her as she made her way to her designated seat. Edmund Cole sat across the room, composed and confident, dressed in his finest coat, clearly relishing the public stage his legal challenge had created. He greeted Eleanor with a small, cold nod as she passed, and she forced herself to meet his gaze without flinching, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. Nathaniel arrived shortly after, accompanied by Whitlock and a folder of documents thick enough to make several onlookers murmur among themselves. He took a seat near the front of the hall, close enough to Eleanor's side that their eyes met briefly across the room, though neither spoke. Eleanor felt her chest tighten at the sight of him. the tangled mix of hurt and longing she had carried all week rising sharply to the surface, though she pushed it firmly aside, knowing she needed all her composure for what was about to unfold. The magistrate called the hearing to order, and Cole rose first, presenting his case with practiced eloquence. He claimed the sale of the Ashworth debt had been conducted improperly, that as the original creditor he retained certain rights over the estate that had been unlawfully circumvented, and that the true intentions behind the debt's purchase deserved scrutiny before any transfer could be considered legitimate. His words were carefully chosen, each sentence dropping subtle insinuations about impropriety, about a wealthy man buying his way into a vulnerable young woman's life under the guise of financial rescue. Eleanor felt her face heat with humiliation as murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd, several eyes sliding toward her with open speculation. She kept her gaze fixed forward, her spine rigid, refusing to shrink beneath the weight of Cole's implications, though her hands twisted tightly together in her lap where no one could see them. When it came time for Nathaniel to respond, he rose with a calm, unhurried authority that immediately shifted the energy in the room. He addressed the magistrate directly, presenting document after document proving the legal soundness of the debt's transfer. Each signature and seal accounted for, each step of the transaction conducted precisely within the bounds of the law. He then turned, with deliberate precision, to the matter of Edmund Cole's own conduct, presenting testimony gathered from several families across the county, who had suffered under Cole's predatory lending practices, patterns of forced foreclosures, coerced marriage arrangements offered as alternatives to ruin, tactics that painted a portrait of a man who used financial desperation as a weapon against the vulnerable. The room fell into a heavy silence as Nathaniel spoke, the earlier murmuring giving way to something closer to shock as the true nature of Cole's business practices came into focus for the assembled crowd. Cole's composed expression finally cracked, fury flashing across his face as he attempted to interject, only to be silenced by the magistrate's stern warning that he would have his opportunity to respond in turn. Then Nathaniel did something Eleanor had not expected. He turned to address the room directly, and with quiet, unwavering honesty, admitted that he had indeed purchased the Ashworth debt personally, that his reasons had been born from genuine concern for Eleanor's welfare after witnessing her hardship firsthand, and that while he acknowledged he should have told her the truth of his involvement much sooner, there had been nothing improper or self-serving in his actions. He stated plainly, his eyes finding Eleanor's across the crowded hall, that his admiration for her had grown from watching her courage and integrity in the face of overwhelming difficulty, not from any desire to control or manipulate her circumstances. Eleanor sat frozen as his words settled over the room, painfully aware of every eye now shifting between herself and Nathaniel, aware that whatever privacy had once existed around their complicated situation had just been stripped away entirely in front of the county's assembled gentry. Part of her burned with fresh humiliation at having her private hurt exposed so publicly, but another part of her, listening closely to the sincerity in his voice, felt something shift within the anger she had carried all week, a crack of understanding forming in the wall she had built around herself since his confession. The magistrate, after reviewing the documentation and hearing the testimony against Cole, ruled decisively in favor of the debt's legitimate transfer, dismissing Cole's challenge entirely and noting for the record the troubling pattern of behavior described by the witnesses against him. Cole's face went ashen as the ruling was announced, the weight of public exposure settling over him in front of the very society whose respect he had spent years cultivating. He left the hall quickly afterward, his reputation already beginning to crumble as whispers of the hearing's revelations spread through the crowd like fire through dry grass. Eleanor remained seated for a long moment after the room began to empty, overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of fortune, by the public unraveling of a man who had haunted her family for months, and by the raw honesty Nathaniel had offered in front of everyone rather than protecting himself with careful half-truths. Margaret squeezed her hand gently, whispering that it was over, that Cole could no longer threaten the estate or her reputation, but Eleanor barely heard the words, her attention fixed instead on Nathaniel, who stood waiting near the doorway, uncertain whether to approach her after everything that had passed between them. She rose slowly and walked toward him, aware of the lingering onlookers still watching with open curiosity, though she found she no longer cared as much about their opinions as she once had. She stopped in front of him, searching his face for a long moment before speaking. She told him that what he had done in that hall, laying his own reputation bare alongside hers rather than protecting himself, had shown her something his earlier silence had obscured, a willingness to be vulnerable in front of others for her sake, even when it would have been far easier to stay quiet and let the ruling stand on documentation alone. Nathaniel answered carefully, telling her he understood if she still needed time, that he had not spoken up expecting forgiveness, only because he refused to let her stand alone against Cole's accusations while he hid behind careful legal language. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, the hurt of the past week still tender but no longer sharp enough to outweigh the clarity she felt standing before him now, and she told him, quietly, that she needed time still, but not distance, that she was willing to try understanding him properly, without secrets standing between them this time. In the days that followed the hearing, the county buzzed with talk of little else. Edmund Cole's carefully built reputation collapsed with startling speed, as the testimonies against him spread from drawing room to drawing room, embellished with each retelling until even families who had never done business with him began quietly distancing themselves from any association with his name. Several of his existing clients moved swiftly to settle their accounts and sever ties, unwilling to risk their own reputations by remaining connected to a man now widely regarded as a predator hiding behind respectable manners. Within a fortnight, Cole quietly left the county altogether, his business interests sold off in haste, his departure marked by none of the fanfare that had once accompanied his arrivals at social gatherings. Eleanor, meanwhile, found herself the subject of a different kind of attention entirely. Where whispers had once painted her as scheming or desperate, the truth revealed at the hearing recast her instead as a woman who had endured genuine hardship with remarkable dignity, who had been targeted unfairly by a man now exposed as a predator, and who had captured the sincere admiration of one of the county's most respected men. Invitations began arriving at Ashwood Manor with a warmth and frequency she had not experienced even before her father's death, though she accepted few of them, still needing time to steady herself after the emotional upheaval of the past weeks. She spent those quiet days walking the grounds of Ashwood Manor with Copper trotting faithfully at her side, turning over everything that had happened in her mind. She thought often of the moment in the magistrate's hall when Nathaniel had chosen honesty over self-protection, laying bare not just the legal facts of the case but his own feelings in front of an audience that could easily have turned his admission into fresh scandal. She recognized, the more she reflected, that his earlier silence about the debt had come from fear rather than malice. Fear of losing something he had not yet dared name even to himself, and while the hurt of discovering his secret had not entirely faded, she found her anger softening into something closer to understanding. Margaret, watching her mistress move through these quiet, thoughtful days, finally spoke plainly one evening, as they sat together in the drawing room. She reminded Eleanor gently that life had given her precious little softness in the past year, that grief and fear had dominated nearly every month since her father's passing, and that perhaps it was worth asking herself honestly whether wounded pride was truly worth sacrificing a chance at real happiness. Eleanor listened without argument, recognizing the truth in Margaret's words even as old caution urged her to remain guarded a while longer. A letter arrived from Nathaniel 3 days later, delivered by his own hand rather than through a footman, though he did not linger at the door when Margaret answered it, leaving only the sealed envelope and a brief message that he would await Eleanor's response whenever she felt ready to give one. Eleanor carried the letter to her father's study and sat for a long while before opening it, Copper curled at her feet as though sensing the importance of the moment. The letter, when Eleanor finally unfolded it, was written in Nathaniel's own hand, not the polished formal script of a secretary but the slightly uneven lines of a man who had clearly written and rewritten his words several times before settling on what to say. He began by apologizing again, more fully than he had managed in the crowded magistrates' hall, explaining that his silence about the debt had never been about doubting her capability, but about his own fear of being seen as just another powerful man attempting to control her life through money, the very thing Edmund Cole had tried to do. He wrote that watching her in the village square that first morning, offering up the one soft comfort left in her life without complaint or self-pity, had struck something in him he had not expected to feel again after years of guarding himself carefully against attachment. He explained that his title had taught him early to be suspicious of anyone's motives toward him, that he had grown accustomed to people wanting things from him rather than simply wanting him, and that Eleanor's fierce independence, her refusal to be pitied or managed, had drawn him in precisely because she had never once tried to use her circumstances to gain anything from him beyond what kindness she was owed as a fellow human being. He confessed that his fear of losing that rare, uncomplicated connection had led him into exactly the kind of secrecy he most despised in other men, and he understood now that no good intention excused the hurt his silence had caused her. He did not ask for forgiveness in the letter, only for the chance to prove, through consistent honesty rather than grand gestures, that he could be trusted going forward, however long that proof might take. Eleanor read the letter twice through, then a third time, tears gathering in her eyes by the final reading, not from renewed hurt, but from the unmistakable sincerity, woven through every line. She folded the letter carefully and held it against her chest for a long moment, Copper lifting his head to watch her with quiet canine concern, before she rose and asked Margaret to have the carriage prepared for the following morning. She arrived at Ravensworth Hall shortly after midday, her heart pounding as the grand estate came into view, so much larger and more imposing than Ashwood Manor, yet somehow less intimidating now that she understood something of the lonely man who called it home. Nathaniel met her personally at the door, clearly having been informed of her arrival, his expression carrying equal parts hope and apprehension, as he led her into a quiet sitting room overlooking the gardens. They spoke for hours that afternoon, more honestly than they had managed even during their earlier, easier conversations. Eleanor told him plainly how his secrecy had made her feel, not simply deceived but momentarily stripped of the hard-won sense that she could manage her own life without a man quietly steering events from behind the scenes. Nathaniel listened without defending himself, acknowledging each point she raised, promising that whatever came next between them, he would never again make decisions on her behalf without her full knowledge and consent. Eleanor in turn admitted that her initial fury had softened considerably once she understood the fear beneath his silence, that she recognized in him the same instinct toward self-protection that grief and hardship had taught her to carry as well. She told him she was willing to move forward slowly, testing this new honesty between them one conversation at a time, rather than pretending the hurt of the past weeks had simply vanished. Nathaniel agreed readily, relief evident in the loosening of his shoulders, telling her he wanted nothing more than the chance to earn back what his silence had cost. As the afternoon stretched into evening, Nathaniel led her out into the gardens, where Copper, who had been dozing near the kitchen door under Beatrice's watchful care, spotted Eleanor and bounded across the lawn with an enthusiasm that made both of them laugh despite the seriousness of their earlier conversation. Eleanor knelt to greet him, and when she looked up she found Nathaniel watching her with an expression so openly tender that her breath caught in her throat. He told her, standing there in the fading afternoon light with the old spaniel circling happily between them, that whatever pace she needed, he intended to remain steady beside her, that he had no interest in rushing toward anything she was not ready for, only in proving, day by day, that he could be the kind of man worthy of the trust she had once given so easily, and that his own foolishness had briefly cost him. Eleanor rose to her feet, closing some of the distance between them, and told him that she believed him, that watching him defend her so publicly at the hearing, laying bare his own reputation rather than hers alone, had already begun rebuilding what his earlier silence had damaged. She said she did not want slow caution forever, only enough time to be certain that what they were building together stood on solid ground rather than unspoken secrets. In the weeks that followed, their courtship continued with a new foundation of transparency that neither had experienced in quite the same way before. Nathaniel involved Eleanor directly in every remaining detail of the estate's financial recovery, consulting her opinion rather than simply managing matters on her behalf, and Eleanor found herself trusting him more deeply with each honest conversation, each small decision made together rather than around her. The county, having witnessed the dramatic unraveling of Edmund Cole's schemes and the public honesty of Nathaniel's declaration at the hearing, embraced their growing attachment with open warmth, gossip transforming from cruel speculation into genuine well-wishing. Ashwood Manor itself began to flourish again under Eleanor's careful management, the debts steadily reduced through sensible reforms she implemented herself, with Nathaniel's support, rather than his direction. Tenant relationships strengthened, the gardens her mother had once tended restored to something resembling their former beauty. Margaret watched these changes with quiet satisfaction, noting how the humming had returned to Eleanor's daily routines, how her laughter came more easily and more often with each passing week. On a crisp morning several months after the hearing, Nathaniel arrived at Ashwood Manor unannounced, though this time there was nothing calculated or secretive in his visit. He found Eleanor in the garden, kneeling in the soil beside the same roses her mother had once planted, the Copper stretched lazily in a patch of sunlight nearby. He knelt beside her without ceremony, taking her soil-stained hand gently in his own, and asked her, with none of the polished formality expected of a duke and every bit of the genuine hope of a man who had learned the value of plain honesty, whether she would consider building the rest of her life alongside his, with no secrets left between them, only the steady partnership she had always deserved. Eleanor, kneeling there in the garden with the dog who had once been her only comfort now watching them both with lazy contentment, felt no hesitation at all in her answer. She said yes, and the quiet joy that settled over both of them in that ordinary garden moment felt far more meaningful than any grand gesture could have offered, built as it was on months of honest struggle rather than easy romance alone. Word of the engagement spread through the county quickly, though this time the whispers carried none of the poison Edmund Cole had once tried to plant. Neighbors who had watched Eleanor's hardship unfold over the past year sent genuine congratulations, and even the vicar's wife, who had once warned Eleanor so carefully about appearances, called personally to offer her blessing, admitting with some embarrassment that she had misjudged the situation entirely when the rumors first began circulating. Margaret wept openly when Eleanor told her the news, pressing both hands to her mouth before pulling Eleanor into a fierce embrace, saying that Eleanor's mother would have been proud beyond words to see her daughter find such steady, honest love after everything she had endured. Margaret had served the Ashworth family long enough to remember Eleanor as a small girl chasing butterflies through these same gardens, and the housekeeper's joy at witnessing this new chapter carried the weight of decades of quiet devotion. Preparations for the wedding began soon after, modest by the standards of Nathaniel's rank, but rich in the details that mattered most to Eleanor. She insisted on holding the ceremony at the small village church where her parents had married, rather than the grander cathedral in the county town that Nathaniel's position might have suggested, and he agreed without hesitation, understanding that she wanted her roots honored rather than erased by her new title. The dressmaker who had once turned away a woman unable to pay her bills now found herself eagerly commissioned to create a gown of pale ivory silk, and Eleanor felt a quiet satisfaction in offering the woman honest, generous business, rather than harboring any resentment over the past. Nathaniel, for his part, threw himself into small gestures that meant more to Eleanor than any display of wealth might have. He worked quietly with his own staff to restore the east wing of Ravensworth Hall, transforming a long-neglected sitting room into a private study modeled after her father's, complete with shelves built specifically to house the books she loved most, so that she would never feel she had left behind everything familiar in exchange for a life among strangers. He asked her opinion on every decision regarding their shared future home, refusing to repeat the mistake of managing things quietly on her behalf, and Eleanor noticed and appreciated the deliberate change in him with each passing week. The autumn afternoon of the wedding arrived clear and golden, the village church filled with familiar faces rather than distant society acquaintances, though a fair number of curious county families had also traveled to witness the union that had become something of a local legend after the dramatic unraveling of Edmund Cole's schemes. Eleanor walked down the narrow aisle on the arm of an elderly family friend who had known her father well, her gown simple and elegant, her expression radiant with a happiness that needed no further ornamentation. Nathaniel waited for her at the altar, and when their eyes met as she approached, Eleanor felt none of the fear or suspicion that had once colored her every interaction with powerful men. She saw only the same steady warmth that had first drawn her to him in the village square, back when she had believed him nothing more than a kind stranger interested in her aging dog. Copper, groomed and wearing a small ribbon Margaret had insisted upon, sat obediently at the front pew throughout the ceremony, occasionally thumping his tail against the wooden floor whenever Eleanor glanced his way, as though offering his own quiet blessing on the proceedings. The ceremony itself was brief and simple, exactly as Eleanor had wanted, focused on the plain exchange of honest vows rather than elaborate ritual. When the vicar finally pronounced them husband and wife, the small church erupted into warm applause, and Eleanor felt, for the first time since her father's death, a sense of complete and settled peace, the kind that came not from having survived hardship, but from having built something genuine and lasting on the other side of it. The wedding breakfast that followed was held in the gardens of Ashwood Manor, the same gardens where Nathaniel had proposed, decorated simply with autumn flowers and lanterns strung between the old oak trees. Neighbors and tenants mingled freely with the small circle of nobility Nathaniel had invited, the usual boundaries of rank softened by genuine celebration. Margaret oversaw the food with fierce pride, having personally supervised every dish served that day, determined that Eleanor's wedding feast would want for nothing despite the modest budget available, before Nathaniel's quiet insistence on covering the costs himself, which Eleanor had finally accepted with grace rather than pride this time, understanding now the difference between generosity offered in secrecy and generosity offered in partnership. As evening settled over the gardens and the last of the guests began departing in their carriages, Eleanor and Nathaniel found a quiet moment alone, near the roses her mother had once tended, Copper dozing contentedly nearby in the cooling autumn air. Eleanor rested her head against her husband's shoulder, thinking back over the long, difficult road that had led her to this moment, from the terror of that first morning knock on her door, through the heartbreak of giving up her dog, through the slow unraveling of Edmund Cole's cruelty, to this quiet, golden evening surrounded by people who genuinely wished her well. She thought of how close she had come to losing everything, and how strange it was that the very act of desperation that had broken her heart, selling copper to a stranger in a village square, had ultimately led her to the very man who would help rebuild everything she feared losing. Nathaniel, sensing the direction of her thoughts, pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head, and told her softly that he intended to spend the rest of his life making certain she never again had to face hardship alone, that whatever came next for them, they would face it together, with nothing hidden, and nothing left unspoken between them. Eleanor closed her eyes, and let herself simply rest in the peace of the moment, the weight of grief and fear that had defined the past year finally beginning to lift, replaced by a quiet, steady hope for everything still to come. A year had passed since that golden autumn wedding, and Ravensworth Hall had grown to feel less like a grand and distant estate, and more like a true home, softened by the presence of a woman who had refused to let her new title erase the warmth she had carried from Ashwood Manor. Eleanor had insisted from the very beginning that both households remain active, dividing her time between the sprawling elegance of Nathaniel's ancestral seat and the smaller, more familiar rooms of the estate where she had grown up, and Nathaniel had never once objected, understanding that her roots mattered as much to their marriage as any grand tradition of his own family. Copper had grown considerably older that year, his muzzle now almost entirely gray, his pace slower on their morning walks through the gardens, but his devotion had never wavered. He split his days between both homes just as his mistress did, curling by the fire in Nathaniel's study during visits to Ravensworth Hall, and reclaiming his old spot at the foot of Eleanor's childhood bed whenever they returned to Ashwood Manor. The household staff at both estates had grown equally fond of him, and it was not uncommon to find him being fed small treats by Beatrice in one kitchen, or fussed over by Margaret in the other, thoroughly spoiled by everyone who crossed his path. Ashwood Manor itself had transformed remarkably under Eleanor's continued stewardship. The debts that had once threatened to destroy everything her family had built were now fully settled, paid off steadily through careful management rather than any single dramatic gesture, a fact that gave Eleanor a quiet pride she cherished perhaps more than any of the grander comforts her marriage had brought her. The tenant cottages had been repaired, the gardens restored to their former beauty, and the estate once again stood as a place of genuine warmth rather than looming anxiety, exactly as her parents would have wanted it. Edmund Cole had never returned to the county, his reputation too thoroughly destroyed by the revelations at the hearing to rebuild any foothold among respectable society. Occasional rumors reached Eleanor through distant acquaintances, suggesting he had attempted similar schemes in other counties, only to find his past following close behind him, families forewarned by the very testimonies that had unraveled him at Ashwood. Eleanor found she no longer thought of him with fear, only with the distant, faintly pitying recognition of a danger that had long since passed. Nathaniel had changed too, in ways both subtle and profound. The careful, guarded reserve he had once carried into every interaction, born from years of suspecting others' motives toward his title and fortune, had softened considerably under the steady honesty of his marriage. He found himself laughing more easily, sharing more openly with his staff and tenants, no longer holding people at the careful distance he had once believed necessary for a man of his position. Whitlock, who had served the family for so many years, remarked more than once to Beatrice that he had never seen the Duke appear so genuinely at ease as he did now, walking the gardens each evening with his wife and her old dog trailing contentedly behind them. Their partnership extended well beyond the personal comfort of their marriage. Eleanor, having lived through the devastating consequences of predatory lending firsthand, worked alongside Nathaniel to establish a modest fund within the county specifically designed to help families facing similar financial hardship, offering fair loan terms and honest guidance, rather than the cruel manipulation Edmund Cole had once practiced. Several families who had nearly lost their homes to circumstances much like Eleanor's own found relief through this quiet initiative, and Eleanor took a personal hand in meeting with many of them herself, understanding better than most the particular terror of watching a family legacy slip away through no fault of one's own. On a mild spring morning, almost exactly a year to the day since Nathaniel had first returned copper to her doorstep, Eleanor sat in the garden of Ashwood Manor with a letter in her lap, this one carrying happier news than any she had received in recent memory. She had learned only days earlier that she was expecting their first child, and she had spent the intervening days turning the knowledge over privately, savoring it before sharing it even with Nathaniel, wanting to choose the right moment to tell him. She found that moment that very evening, as they walked together through the same roses where he had once proposed, Copper moving slowly but happily beside them in the fading light. When she told him, quietly and without ceremony, watching his face carefully for his reaction, she saw something break open in his expression, a joy so unguarded and complete that it brought tears to her own eyes before he had even managed to find the words to respond. Nathaniel knelt beside her right there among the roses, resting his hand gently against her still flat stomach, and told her, his voice thick with emotion, that he could not have imagined, standing in that muddy village square over a year ago watching a heartbroken young woman say goodbye to her dog, that fate was leading him toward the fullest happiness he had ever known. Eleanor laughed through her own tears, telling him that she certainly could not have imagined it either, that the darkest morning of her life, the morning she thought she had lost everything, had somehow become the very beginning of everything good that followed. They stood together in the garden as dusk settled fully over Ashwood Manor, Copper stretched out contentedly at their feet, the old spaniel who had once been sold in desperation, now resting peacefully in the home he had helped bring back together, surrounded by the family he had unknowingly played a part in creating. The estate around them, once teetering on the edge of ruin, now stood restored and thriving, its future secured not through the cold calculations of debt and marriage that Edmund Cole had once tried to impose, but through genuine partnership, hard-won trust, and the simple, enduring loyalty of a dog who had never once stopped believing in the woman who loved him. In the months that followed, word spread gently through the county of the coming heir to the Ravensworth line, and well wishes poured in from neighbors and tenants alike, many of them the very families who had once whispered cruel rumors before the truth of Eleanor's character had been so publicly proven. Eleanor accepted their kindness with the same grace she had shown throughout her ordeal, holding no lasting bitterness toward those who had doubted her, understanding that fear and gossip often said more about the people spreading it than about the person they targeted. As the seasons turned once more and the estate settled into the quiet rhythms of expectant joy, Eleanor often found herself returning, in quiet, unguarded moments, to that first terrible morning in the village square, to the crushing weight of watching Copper's leash pass from her hand into a stranger's grip. She no longer felt only grief when she remembered it, but a strange, grateful wonder at how completely that single desperate choice had reshaped the entire course of her life, leading her not toward the loss she had feared, but toward a home, a partnership, and a family more complete than she had ever dared to hope for in the darkest days after her father's death. Copper lived to see the birth of Eleanor and Nathaniel's first child that following winter, greeting the newborn with the same gentle devotion he had shown Eleanor throughout every hardship of the past several years, curling faithfully beside the cradle each evening, as though standing guard over the newest member of the family he had helped bring together. And though the old dog's days were growing fewer, Eleanor took quiet comfort in knowing that whatever time remained to him, he would spend it exactly where he belonged, surrounded by the love he had never once stopped believing he would find his way back to. Margaret remained at Ashwood Manor throughout those years, refusing every gentle suggestion from Eleanor that she retire to a quieter life, insisting instead that she had watched over the family through its darkest days, and intended to remain to see it flourish for as long as her health allowed. She took to the role of doting presence in the child's early life, with the same fierce devotion she had once shown Eleanor herself, and the two households, Ashwood and Ravensworth, settled into an easy rhythm of shared visits and overlapping traditions that neither Eleanor nor Nathaniel had anticipated when they first exchanged their vows. Whitlock, ever precise in his record-keeping, later noted in a private ledger meant only for the family's own history, that the entire fortune of understanding between the Duke and his wife had been built upon a single quiet transaction in a village square, the purchase of an aging spaniel for a price far greater than any dog was worth, and yet cheap beyond measure for everything it had ultimately purchased in return. Beatrice, less inclined toward formal record-keeping, simply told the younger kitchen staff each autumn, as the leaves began to turn, the story of how their Duke had once disguised himself as an ordinary traveler and fallen in love with a woman's quiet courage, before either of them understood what was happening. Eleanor herself rarely told the story in full to outsiders, preferring to keep the rawest parts of that difficult year close to her heart, shared only with Nathaniel and, in time, with the child who grew up chasing Copper's descendants through the very same gardens where her parents had first found their way back to each other. But on quiet evenings, when the fire burned low and the house settled into peaceful silence, she would sometimes find herself telling small pieces of it anyway, of a cold morning knock at the door, of a leash slipping from her trembling hand, of a stranger's kindness that turned out to be so much more than it first appeared. Nathaniel, listening to these retellings from his chair beside her, always ended with the same quiet observation, that he had once believed himself incapable of trusting anyone fully with the truth of his own heart, and that it had taken watching a grieving young woman say goodbye to her dog, with more grace than most people managed in far easier circumstances, to teach him what genuine courage actually looked like. Eleanor would always answer that she had learned something equally important from him in return, that even the deepest kindness needed honesty to survive, and that love built in secrecy, however well-intentioned, could never grow as strong as love built in the open. Years later, when their child was old enough to ask about the small portrait of an aging spaniel that hung in the East Wing study, Eleanor would smile and tell the story from the very beginning, of a woman who once believed she had nothing left to lose, and a man who had quietly made certain she never had to find out how wrong she was.